Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the YouTube channel grecochess, the channel where we discuss, we analyze, and we comment on the game of chess. I'm your host. My name is Kari Lausanesiris, and in this video, we have an exciting development in the online tournament grecochess, which takes place at the platform of chess.com. When the tournament started last September, there were 16 participants divided into 4 groups of 4. The first of each of them advanced to the final round, which started about a little bit more than a month ago. And until recently, 11 out of these 12 games had been completed. And after the 11 games, baraks7 from Israel was leading with 5 points versus 4 points from Govorukha from the Ukraine. And the last game was going to be maximgovorukha from the Ukraine versus baraks7 from Israel. maximgovorukha with the white pieces, and if maximgovorukha won, the two players would tie with 5 points, and we would need to find the tie-breaking procedure. Most likely, I would discuss with them to agree on something. But if baraks7 could get at least a draw, then baraks7 is the winner. But let's go now and see what exactly happened to the game that was completed just yesterday. And let me share the screen with you. And here we are. What you're going to see is on the screen, you're only going to see a part of the overall screen, meaning the part with the chessboard, because the rest of the screen would show how the game continued and would basically tell you the result. And we don't want to spoil the surprise. We want to keep it exciting until the very end. You see, Maxim Govorukha has the white pieces, has a rating of 1755, while baraks7 has a rating of 1758. So the game promises to be a very exciting one. And Maxim Govorukha starts with the pawn going to d4. You see the little booklets? This means it's a book move, meaning it has been analyzed in opening theory. By the way, after every move, you'll see a little sign indicating what does the computer think about this move. Booklet for the first few moves means it's opening theory. 2 exclamation points means it is brilliant. 1 exclamation point means it is great. A star means it is the best possible. A thumbs up means excellent. A checkpoint is a good. Question mark followed by exclamation point means it's an inaccuracy. And if there is 1 question mark, it's a mistake, and 2 question marks, it's a blunder. Also, you're going to see a green arrow indicating which move would have been the best. And here on these numbers, you see what does the computer think about the position. Currently, it thinks that after the first move that white is better by 0.2. But that means nothing just because white started first and they played the book move. And baraks7 replies the knight to f6. When pawn goes to d4, black replies either pawn goes to d5 or knight goes to f6. Let me show another of the other popular move for white. And this is what I usually play. Continue. And when the first pawn goes to d4, then the next move, the pawn goes to c4. This is what usually white is doing, although not necessarily. Perhaps he could have sent the knight to f3 or done something else. But Maxim Govorukha plays the most common move for that, and baraks7 sends pawn to e6. Knight to c3 for Maxim Govorukha, still book, and baraks7 with a book move pins the knight on c3. So the knight on c3 cannot move because otherwise the king is exposed. But Maxim Govorukha breaks the pin by bringing the dark color bishop to d2. Kingside castling to baraks7. Both sides try to develop their pieces, control the center, and be ready for the fight. And next move, Maxim Govorukha sends the pawn to e3. And in case you wonder why 3 and not e4, because pawn went to e4, then bishop takes knight, and then one of pawn or bishop takes bishop, and then knight takes pawn, and black wins the pawn. That's why the pawn went only to e3. But this is the last book move, because now baraks7 is going to play a move that computer thinks it's an excellent one. You see the thumbs up means excellent move, while the best would have been the pawn going to b6. That's what the computer recommends. You see the great arrow. We completed the first 5 moves, and let's see what is the score. White, meaning maximgovorukha, is leading by 0.2, but that means almost nothing, just in the beginning. Knight to f3, excellent for maximgovorukha. Pawn to d5, the best for barak7. This time is it's the best possible move. Bishop to d3 for maximgovorukha, and pawn to c5 for barak7. Now the computer would want maximgovorukha to castle. You see the green arrow, but instead we have the first inaccuracy to the game. Until now, players were playing either book moves or the best or excellent. So pawn goes to the c4, pawn takes on d5 for maximgovorukha. Computer thinks it's an inaccuracy. Pawn takes back on d5 from e6 to d5 for barak7, which computer thinks the best. Kingside castling for maximgovorukha. Computer would rather have the d4 pawn taking on c5. You see the green arrow. And since white would not take the pawn on c5, barak7 sends the pawn to c4 and threatens the bishop on d3 that needs to move. The bishop moves, but not to e2 as the computer would like, but to b1. Just a good move, the check mark. And knight to c6 for barak7. We completed the first 10 moves, and you see that barak7 is already leading by 0.5. Pawn to h3 for maximgovorukha to avoid having a bishop pinning the knight on g4, or even the knight on f6 going to g4 and attacking. And until now, barak7 was playing either book or best or excellent moves. This is the first inaccuracy for barak7. Takes a knight on c3. Usually, you'd rather have a bishop than a knight. A computer would rather have the pawn going to go to a6, and from there it might start a queenside pawn storm. Bishop takes back, and the white bishop, the dark-colored white bishop, controls the long diagonal from a1 to h8. Bishops love these long diagonals because this is where they can exert pressure on the largest number of squares, including the 2 central squares. For now, if anything, the white pawns are blocking this bishop, but who knows later. Barak7 sends his knight on e4 and attacking the bishop on c3. Bishop goes back to e1. The computer doesn't like it. Would rather have the knight from f3 going to e2 and attack the black knight. Pawn to a6 for barak7, another inaccuracy. Bishop to c2 for maximgovorukha, just a good move. Computer shows what it thinks would have been the best move. Bishop to f5 for barak7. Now, this bishop is the best move, but one needs to be careful because this bishop is not protected. It is what's called loose. Of course, it's not attacked, so it's not going to be immediately lost, but black better be careful. Queen to b1 for maximgovorukha that wants to control the diagonal from b1 to h7. It's not the longest, the second longest, but it's one leading towards the black king, and it's nice if you can control it, even though the computer doesn't like it, thinks it's a mistake, you see here, question mark. But barak7 better be careful with his knight. Currently, it's attacked twice by the bishop and by the queen, and defended 3 times by the pawn, the bishop, and the rook. Currently, it's not in danger, but who knows? And barak7 sends the queen to f6. Inaccuracy is the computer would rather have the pawn go to b5 and start a queen side pawn storm. But we completed the first 15 moves, and let's see the score. Barak7 is leading by 0.7, as you see here. Let's continue. Knight to d2 for barak7, that is threatening the knight on e4. It's attacked now 3 times and defended 3 times. Still not enough to win it, but you never know. It constrains the black pieces that must keep supporting. And if this knight leaves, if it goes, for example, to g5, then the bishop on f5 is lost. Attacked twice, defended once. That is why barak7 moved the knight, but to d6 instead. And so it defends the bishop a third time. Bishop takes bishop for maximgovorukha, and knight takes back for barak7. Knight f3 for maximgovorukha. Computer would rather have the pawns go to b3. You'll see it for a few moves later. In this way, first of all, the pawn at c4 cannot move to c3. It will be taken by the bishop. If it goes to b3, it will be taken by the pawn on b3. And of course, you like to capture towards the center and your opponent capturing away from the center. If it stays, if it does nothing, if black does nothing, pawn goes to b3 and black does nothing, then the pawn can take the one on c4 and go towards the center, and black will take it back by having a pawn away from the center. That's why this is the move preferred by the computer. Knight to d6 for barak7, not the best. Queen to c2 for maximgovorukha. Again, you see the arrow. Computer would prefer the pawn going to b3. Knight to e4 for barak7 has a knight in white's half of the board. But computer, once again, computers want the b pawns to be moved for both sides. The b2 to b3 and the b7 to b5. Pawn to a3 for barak7. And finally, pawn to b5, pawn to a3 for maximgovorukha. And finally, the pawn to b5 for barak7. Computer thinks the best. We completed 20 moves, and as you see on the score, barak7 black is leading by 0.9. Still, the difference is very small. Anything can change. Let's see how game continues. Knight to d4 to d2 for maximgovorukha. Again, computer wants pawn to b3. And rook to c8 for barak7. Computer wants queen to g6 to be facing the white king on g1. Knight takes knight for maximgovorukha. But rook comes back for barak7. So black, instead of having a knight on e4, they have a rook on e4. And this combined with the queen on f6, they are going for an attack. And it's not so difficult for black to bring the other knight and rook, while the black king seems to be safe. Yes, they may have a back rank issue in the long term, but they have pawns in front of it. Rook to c1 for maximgovorukha. Again, computer wants pawn to b3. And rook to e6 for barak7. Queen to d1 for maximgovorukha. Again, computer wants to b3. And look to e8 for barak7, that's controlling the semi-open e file. We call it semi-open because there is only one white pawn on e3 and no black pawns there. Bishop goes to c3 for maximgovorukha. That may be once again longing for the long diagonal from a1 to h8. Pawn to a5 for barak7. Mistakes as a computer. Basically, it is a wasted move because it does nothing while the game is played in the king side of the board, where the two kings are located. Bishop to e1 for maximgovorukha, misses a chance to send the pawn to b3 that the computer would love. But before that, we have completed 25 moves, and barak7 is ahead by 0.4. Most of the time ahead, but the margin is very small. Bishop to e1 for maximgovorukha, pawn to b4 for barak7. And is trying now to see if he can send his pawns near promotion, especially since he has a 3-2 majority on the ABC files, and perhaps might be able to create a passed pawn. Queen to a4 for maximgovorukha. Computer wants the queen to go to h5 instead on the king side of the board. Rook to b8 for barak7, that supports a b4. See if he can promote. We exchanged on b4. So the rook on b8 protects the pawn on b4, but let's see if he can go ahead. method or the tactic to have to promote is create a pass pawn by exchanging the C pawns, and then the B pawn is a pass pawn. But will it work? That is nice as a thought, but doesn't always work. Bishop to D2 for maximgovorukha. Pawn to H6 for barak7, which creates what's called Luft, a German word that means air. And in chess, it means that black does not have to worry about background threats. If queen or a rook end up in the 8th rank and check the black king, king can escape to H7. Doesn't have to worry about his protection. Rook to E1 for Maxim Govorukha, and Maxim Govorukha has full control of the open A file. And we call it open because there are no pawns there. It's nice to control the open files. Doesn't win the game by itself, but it's a positive element to have it. Let's continue. Queen goes to F5 for barak7, and we completed the first 30 moves, and barak7 is ahead by 1.6. It already has queen and rook facing near the white king. The other rook may need only 2-3 moves to make it. The knight, perhaps, there's a pawn on pawns on b4, c4 that might threaten to promote. So clearly, barak7 has what's called the initiative. It doesn't win the game by itself, but better having you the initiative and threatening the opponent than the other way around. But let's continue. King to h2 for Maxim Govorukha that may want to avoid having black checking him from the first rank. Usually that can help a pawn promote. But if the move is not a check, you give your opponent one extra move to defend themselves. Pawn to c3, and this computer says it is a blunder. You see the two question marks. Computer would rather have the queen go to d3. Of course, what black wants to do is exchange and have a passed pawn. Exchanges will happen. No, but now you see that barak7 is not going to take back the pawn. Instead, the pawn at b4 goes to b3 and is now what's called a passed pawn. 2 squares away from promotion and not easy to be stopped because white doesn't have a knight, doesn't have a light color bishop, can only capture it with a queen or with one of the rooks. But this is not so easy, and if the pawn is protected by a knight, they're going to lose at least an exchange. Plus, the queen on f5 controls the b1 square of promotion. But let's see what's going to happen. Rook to b1 for Maxim Govorukha occupies the square. Fortunately, the other rook on f1 supports the rook on b1. And pawn now goes to b2, 1 square away from promotion. But how can it be stopped? Not very easy, because the dark colored bishop on d2 cannot take it. There's a pawn on c3 that stops it. And the bishop goes to c1. You may think the pawn will take the bishop and promote. No, if you start doing so, eventually you're going to be behind after all the trades are made. What's going to happen if the bishop goes here? Black is not going to promote, but is going to use that queen from f5 to capture. Let's do it again. If bishop goes to c1, then queen takes the rook on b1 because the rook on f1 cannot protect any longer the rook on b1. But let's see what happened in the game. Queen went back to d1. Computer doesn't like it. Computer would rather have queen go to a2 because then you threaten twice. If queen goes here, you threaten twice the pawn on b2. It's defended only once by the rook on b8. And it's not easy to see how to defend this pawn. But instead, Maxim Govorukha may be thinking that he needs as many pieces on the first rank as possible. So knight goes to a5 for barak7, and the computer calls it a great move. You see the exclamation point. Because the knight doesn't go there to stay, it goes there to continue moving and become even more dangerous. We'll see how. Queen to e2 for barak7, and knight goes to c4 for queen to e2 for maximgovorukha, and knight to c4 for barak7. Now we have a knight protecting the pawn. The pawn protected twice, defended only once. Not only that, the bishop that before, perhaps before the pawn could go to c4 and the bishop to c3 and then attack the pawn on b2. Now that's not possible. And as we mentioned before, the bishop cannot go to c1, not because of the pawn taking the queen promoting, but because of the queen winning the rook on b1. We completed the first 35 moves, and now really the advantage of barak7 is significant, 4.2. This means that unless Maxim Govorukha makes any major mistakes, barak7 should be going towards victory. And don't forget, a tie favors barak7 that will still become the champion. So Maxim Govorukha must win the game. It doesn't seem easy at all. Let's see what will he do. Rook to fd1. Knight to a3 for barak7, and now threatens the rook on b1. If the rook moves, pawn promotes. If the rook doesn't move, knight takes the rook. Let's see what is going to happen. It seems very promising for barak7. Queen to f1 and queen to c2 for barak7 that doesn't yet take the knight. Perhaps he may want to win as much material as possible and not just an exchange. Queen to e1 for Maxim Govorukha, and finally barak7 with his knight at a3 wins the rook on b1. Now the material advantage, but for barak7 becomes large, but not so easy because rook from d1, Maxim Govorukha's rook from d1 will take the knight on b1. So the material difference is not that big, just a +1 as you see here. Let's see how game continues. King a pawn to f5 for barak7 that wants to start pushing the pawns to the king side to create additional pressure. Because as I say in the ending, if you have one weakness, like here the pawn on b2, that the weakness, the b file for white, they might bring down their pieces and defending. But if they have a second weakness on the fgh files, then it will be impossible to do so. King to g1 and pawn to f4, and barak7 continues pushing his f-pawn, as close as possible to promotion. We completed the first 40 moves, and barak7 has a big advantage, 4.7, as you see here. This kind of advantage means that unless you blunder or make a lot of mistakes, you're going to win. Let's see what happens. King goes back to h2, and we exchange on e3, and rook to b3. You may notice, not yet, the pressure becomes more and more for barak7 against Maxim Govorukha. Pawn to g4 for Maxim Govorukha. I'm not sure where exactly it leads. The g and h pawns, even with the f pawn, only with a miracle they might create any kind of a threat. So I went too fast. First of all, the rook goes to c3. The problem with the pawn going to g4 is that the pawn on f2 is pinned. So when the rook went to c3, it can win the bishop on e3 without worrying about the f2 pawn. Of course, still there's the queen on e1. It's much easier. So white, Maxim Govorukha, in order to avoid such things, sends a king to g3. And barak7 decides to sacrifice an exchange. And we completed the first 45 moves. And you see here that barak7 has an advantage of 6.0. It's very, very significant. Materially, they're more or less the same. Every side has queen and rook, and 4 versus 3 points for barak7, but it's not the 4 versus 3 points. It is that they have a pawn on b2 ready to promote. And Maxim Govorukha still needs to keep the queen and the rook just to avoid the pawn from promotion. Will it happen? Let's see. Queen will take the rook, and now queen takes the rook for barak7. And the only thing that stops the pawn on b2 from promoting is its own queen on b1. Queen to e8 check for Maxim Govorukha to postpone the inevitable. King to h7, only move. Queen to f7. But now once the queen leaves from b1, the black queen, and also baraks7 does it with a check, meaning that white cannot think of moving the queen somewhere to stop the promotion. The promotion is sure because the king will go somewhere, doesn't matter where, g2, and pawn to b1, and at this point, baraks7 has two queens versus one. Two queens versus one almost always guarantees win. I'm going to tell you one exception from one game of my own that went all the way up to 139 moves, and until recently it was the longest game I ever played, where I had one queen, had king queen, my opponent had queen, king, and two queens. But as I was trying desperately to bring some kind of a threefold repetition, and my opponent tried to avoid it, he ended up sending his queen at the wrong square, and I had a steward, and they won the queen, and then both of us had the king and the queen, and eventually I got a draw. But other than this miracle draw that I had a long time ago, and my opponent sent me a comment that I was too lucky, usually two queens defeat one queen. And they defeat it even easier if it's possible to exchange. Now let's see what maximgovorukha will do. It's not easy to check the black king and hope for a perpetual. It tries to do so by sending the queen on f5. But look what's happening. One of the queens of baraks7 wins the queen of maximgovorukha. Of course, next move, maximgovorukha will take back the queen, but at this point, after 50 moves, the advantage of baraks7 is 7.1. And yes, maximgovorukha will take back the queen, but with one queen and 3 pawns versus 3 pawns, the only way that baraks7 may not win the game is if he messes up a stalemate. There are no passed pawns for white. Even the pawn structure is better for black with 2 islands versus 3 islands. 2 islands for black versus 2 islands is 1 pawn, and these 2 pawns for black. While for white, they will have 3 islands, 1, 2, 3, and usually the fewer islands, the better. And baraks7 will win also the d4 pawn, so baraks7 has a second passed pawn, the d5. maximgovorukha tries to push the f pawn, goes to f6, but will be taken by the queen. Even now, baraks7 that is sure to win is thinking about the pawn islands and takes it back with a queen and not with a pawn. Pawn to h4 for maximgovorukha. Pawn to d4 for baraks7. King g4, pawn d3. And we're entering the m area. Let's go back where we started with the m's. After 52 moves, 7.8 advantage for black, you see, but now it is m7 for baraks7, meaning if he plays correctly, at most 7 moves in his mate. M6, M5, M4, M3, M2, and now check from F4 for baraks7. King goes to H3, and now baraks7 has 4 ways to checkmate. Let's see which ones they are. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Which of the 4 ways will baraks7 decide to checkmate, or will he miss the checkmate? He doesn't. Queen goes to H1, and it checkmate. And baraks7 is winning this game and becomes the grecochess champion. But let's now go to the other screen to see what does the computer think about the game. I will go to which screen will we go? Here we are. Game review. 80.3 percentage for maximgovorukha, 89.7 for baraks7. And let's see their rating. They played as if The rating of Maxim Govorukha was 1400, less than his 1755, while Barak7 played as if his rating was 2050, more than his 1758. If you go to the specifics, no brilliances, one great move each of them. Book moves 5 versus 4 for Maxim Govorukha, best 28 versus 20 for Barak7, excellent 13 versus 9 for Barak7, good 12 versus 4 for Maxim Govorukha. Inaccuracies 8 Maxim Govorukha, 6 Barak7. Mistakes 2 Maxim Govorukha, 1 is for Barak7, 1 miss for Maxim Govorukha, and 1 blunder for Barak7. And let's see the final score now. In the pairings, we'll see. In the final round, you see that Barak7 got the first place. He's the champion with 6 points. Barak7, congratulations. We are very happy for you. But also congratulations to Maxim Govorukha that got second place with 4 points. And my skin from Italy that got the third place with 1.5. Well, myself, the Harry. Yes, I made it the final round, but I ended up with 1 draw and 5 losses. Half a point, 4th place. What else ahead? I just started now the next, and I'm organizing the next tournament that is grecochess 64, where now we're going to have 64 instead of 16 players. As soon as we have 64 players, the tournament is starting. Again, groups of 4 where the first one advances. We minimize the time control to 1 day no vacation to make sure that the games will finish in a reasonable amount of time. Until now, we only have 1 registration, myself. I'm hoping that you will decide to participate. It's going to be a very exciting tournament. But that's it for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the viewers, the comments, the likes, and also thanks to the subscribers. If you cannot subscribe, please consider doing so. Once again, this is the Greco Chess channel. I'm your host, Harilaos Aniziris, and at this point, for all of you, goodbye.